You don't actually have a productivity problem. You have something much deeper than that. Because look at your life for a second. You're not sitting around doing nothing all day. You're thinking about what you should be doing. You're planning. You're opening apps. You're reorganizing your tasks. You're busy. But when it comes to actually starting the thing that matters most, you hesitate. You stall. You wait. And then the deadline shows up. Now everything changes. Suddenly you're focused. You're efficient. You're even proud of how much you can get done in such a short time. And this creates a very dangerous belief. That pressure is your superpower. That stress is what makes you effective. That without urgency, you would fall apart. And here's why this matters. Because over time, you start building your entire life around this pattern. You delay starting, you rely on pressure, you recover, and then you repeat it again and again and again and again until one day you realize something feels off. You're getting things done, but it feels heavy. Everything feels like effort. Even the things you once cared about. Rest doesn't feel like rest anymore. It feels like guilt. And ambition starts to feel exhausting. Not exciting, exhausting. And that's the moment most people make a mistake. They think the solution is, I need more discipline, more structure, more control, more pressure. But here's what most people never figure out. The problem might not be that you lack discipline. The problem might be that your system only works when your nervous system is under threat. And that's not a productivity system. That's a survival pattern. Because if the only way you can begin is by feeling bad, then every meaningful thing in your life becomes tied to discomfort. And eventually you start avoiding your own goals. Not because you're lazy, but because your brain knows what comes with them. Stress, pressure, emotional cost. And this is exactly where things start to change. Because there's this idea, and it sounds simple at first, but it completely flips everything. That productivity is not driven by discipline alone, it's driven by how you feel. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Now this isn't just some abstract theory. This comes from someone who lived inside the exact system you're probably living in right now. Ali Abdaal wasn't sitting in a cafe writing about motivation. He was working as a junior doctor, long hours, high pressure, constant responsibility, the kind of environment where discipline isn't optional. It's expected. And for a while, that system worked. He was productive. He was achieving. He was doing what ambitious people are supposed to do. But there was a problem. It wasn't sustainable. Because eventually, the pressure stopped being a tool and started becoming the cause. And that's the moment this whole idea began. Not as a theory, but as a question. Why does productivity feel so hard, even when you're doing everything right? Now here's where things get interesting, because for years we've been taught a very specific version of productivity. Wake up early, push through resistance, stay disciplined, ignore your feelings, and on the surface that works, until it doesn't. Because here's what nobody tells you. Your emotional state is not separate from your ability to work. It directly affects it. Think about it. There are days when everything feels easier. You're more creative. You think faster. You make better decisions. And there are days when even small tasks feel heavy. Same brain, same skills, same goals, different state. And that difference changes everything. There's a psychologist named Barbara Fredrickson who studied this exact phenomenon. And what she found is something called the broaden and build effect. When you feel positive emotions, even small ones, your brain literally expands its ability to think. You see more options. You connect ideas faster. You solve problems more creatively. But when you feel stress, anxiety, or pressure, your brain does the opposite. It narrows. It focuses only on immediate survival, which means less creativity, less flexibility, more resistance. And here's the part that changes how you see everything. If you're constantly trying to work from a stress state, you're trying to build your future from a mentally restricted version of yourself. That's not just inefficient. It's limiting. Now let's make this even more uncomfortable. Because this is where most people get it wrong. They think, if I make work enjoyable, I'll become less serious. And honestly, that sounds logical. Because we've been trained to associate seriousness with struggle. If it's hard, it must be meaningful. If it's enjoyable, it must be shallow. But that's a false trade-off, because enjoyment doesn't reduce performance, it often increases it. And this is where the idea of energy comes in, not motivation, energy. Because motivation is inconsistent, but energy can be built. There's a simple way to think about this. 3 things that change how you show up to your work: play, power, people. Not in a fluffy way, in a functional way. Play means making the process itself slightly more enjoyable. Power means feeling capable and in control of what you're doing. People means feeling connected, even indirectly, to others. And when those 3 things are present, work doesn't feel like something you have to force. It feels like something you can enter. And that's a completely different experience. But none of this matters if you still can't start. Because at the end of the day, you can understand all of this. You can agree with it. You can even believe it, and still find yourself staring at a task, not moving. So what's actually happening there? Why do smart, capable, disciplined people still procrastinate? Here's where things get really important, because most people think procrastination is a personality flaw. They think, I'm lazy, I lack discipline, I just need to push harder. But that explanation doesn't hold up, because the same person who procrastinates for hours can suddenly become incredibly productive under pressure. So what changed? It's not ability. It's not intelligence. It's not even discipline. It's the emotional condition. Procrastination is not laziness. It's a signal. It usually comes from one of 3 things. Uncertainty. You don't know exactly what to do, so your brain avoids starting. Fear. You care about the outcome, so you hesitate to risk doing it badly. Inertia. You're simply not in motion yet, and starting feels harder than continuing. That's it. Not laziness, just friction. And once you see this, everything changes, because now the question is no longer, how do I force myself to do this? It becomes, what is blocking me from starting? And that's a completely different problem. Because now you can solve it. And here's what most people miss about this book. Most summaries will tell you, make work enjoyable, reduce friction, build better habits. But that's not the real message. The deeper message is much more uncomfortable. That your relationship with work might be built on self-pressure, and if your self-worth is tied to how much you push yourself, then even your ambition becomes something heavy, something you have to survive, instead of something you get to pursue. Distance. And that's why this matters so much. Because you're not just optimizing your schedule, you're shaping how your entire life feels. Now let's go one layer deeper, because even if you fix procrastination, there's still something waiting for you on the other side. And most people don't see it coming. And that's the trap. Because once you stop seeing procrastination as a character flaw, you start seeing something much more important. That your behavior has logic. Even the frustrating parts, even the parts you judge, even the parts you hide from yourself. And if your behavior has logic, then your life can be redesigned. Not through shame, through understanding. That's the shift. The shift most people never make, because most people stay at the surface. They keep asking, how do I become more disciplined? Well, the better question is, what kind of emotional environment am I trying to do my life inside? And once you ask that question honestly, you end up somewhere most productivity advice never takes you: burnout. Because here's the thing, a lot of ambitious people think burnout is something that happens to other people. People in impossible jobs. People with terrible bosses. People who can't handle pressure. Not them, not the high-functioning ones. Not the people who still hit deadlines. Not the people who are still showing up. But burnout doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks very normal. You still reply to emails, you still attend meetings, you still finish projects. You're just doing all of it with a kind of deadness you can't explain. A heaviness, that specific kind of tired where nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels alive either. And that's why this part matters so much. Because if you only define burnout as collapse, you'll miss it while it's already happening. And once that happens, you don't just lose energy, you lose meaning. Now here's where this gets really uncomfortable. Because the version of burnout most people know is only one version. Working too much, doing too much, never stopping. That's real, but it's not the whole story. Ali talks about 3 different forms of burnout, and once you understand them, you start seeing why so many productive people still feel broken. The first one is overexertion. That's the obvious one. Too much output, too much demand, too little space. This is the person who says yes to everything. The person who treats rest like a luxury. The person who secretly believes that if they stop moving, they'll become irrelevant. So they keep going. And because they keep going, everyone around them thinks they're fine, until they're not. But here's what's dangerous. Overexertion burnout is often socially rewarded. People praise it. They call it commitment. They call it excellence. They call it drive. But underneath all of that, the person is disappearing. And because the world rewards visible output, they don't realize they're burning themselves down until the fire is already expensive. The second type is depletion. And honestly, this one might be even more common. Because depletion is what happens when you keep spending energy, but never deeply restoring it. Not really. You rest, technically. You scroll, you watch something, you sit down, but you don't actually recover. You're never fully off. You're never fully present. You're just less active. And there's a difference, a huge difference, because your brain can survive intensity. What it can't survive is intensity without renewal. Think about your phone battery for a second. If you use it all day, every day, and only charge it for 5 minutes at random times, what happens? It still turns on, but it becomes unreliable. That's what a lot of people are living like, functional, but unreliable, capable, but internally underpowered. And this is where life gets weird, because you start blaming yourself for not feeling motivated, when the truth is, you're under-recovered. You don't need another hack. You need your energy back. That's not laziness, that's depletion. And then there's the third kind. And this is the one that hits the hardest, misalignment. This is when your work stops feeling connected to who you are. Or maybe it never was. You're still doing things, still achieving, still making progress. But deep down, something feels off. Because the ladder you're climbing might not even be leaning against the right wall. And that kind of burnout is brutal, because it doesn't always show up as exhaustion. Sometimes it shows up as numbness, a lack of care, a weird resistance to goals you used to think you wanted. And when that happens, most people make the wrong interpretation. They think, I've become lazy. I've lost my edge. Something is wrong with me. But sometimes the real issue is much simpler. You're trying to stay committed to a version of success that no longer feels true. And your body knows it before your ego does. Chadwick. That's why this part of the book matters so much, because burnout is not always a work volume problem. Sometimes it's a work meaning problem. Sometimes it's a self-betrayal problem. And if you don't name that, you can spend years trying to fix your habits while staying loyal to the wrong life. Now, I want to tell you about the part most people don't expect, because this is where the book stops being about productivity and starts becoming about identity. About the kind of person you are becoming every time you sit down to work, because every time you force yourself through your life using guilt, you reinforce something. You reinforce the belief that important things must feel heavy, that meaningful work must feel hard, that if you're not suffering, it doesn't count, and that belief is expensive, not just emotionally, practically, because when your brain learns that effort equals pain, it starts protecting you from your own ambitions. That's why you procrastinate on the things that matter most. That's why your best ideas sometimes stay stuck in notebooks. That's why you could be incredibly capable and still feel strangely blocked. It's not random. Your system is reacting exactly the way it was trained to react. And this is where most summaries stop too early. They tell you to reduce friction, and that's true. They tell you to make work more enjoyable, also true. But here's the deeper truth. If your self-worth is tied to pressure, then even when you improve your systems, you will unconsciously keep recreating stress. Because stress doesn't just feel painful. For some people, it feels familiar. And familiar feels safe, even when it hurts. That's the part almost nobody says out loud. And it explains a lot. Why some people sabotage calm periods, why they delay until things become urgent, why they feel strangely empty when life is finally stable. Because if your identity was built around being the person who handles pressure, then peace can feel like irrelevance. And that's terrifying. Now think about how dangerous that is. Because if pressure is how you prove your value, then you will keep manufacturing pain just to feel legitimate, not consciously, but consistently. And that means your productivity problem is no longer about calendars or habits. It's about self-concept. It's about what kind of emotional atmosphere you think you need in order to matter. And once you see that, you can't go back to surface-level advice, because surface-level advice can't solve identity-level friction. So what do you do with that? What do you do when you realize your entire system has been built around stress, urgency, and emotional cost? You don't throw your life away. You don't quit everything tomorrow. You don't suddenly become some hyper-balanced monk with perfect boundaries and herbal tea at 6 p.m. That's not real. And honestly, it's not helpful. What you do is much simpler. You start becoming a scientist of your own energy. That's one of the most useful ideas in the whole book. You stop assuming there's one perfect productivity system, and you start asking, what actually helps me come alive? What makes work lighter for me? What consistently drains me? What kind of conditions make action easier? That's a much smarter way to live, because now you're not trying to obey someone else's system. You're building one that fits your actual nervous system, your actual psychology, your actual life. And that's the difference between consuming productivity content and actually becoming more free. If your system only works when you're stressed, it doesn't work. It's just producing output at an emotional cost you haven't fully calculated yet. And the scary part is, you can keep winning like that for years. You can look successful, you can look reliable, you can look impressive, and still be building a life that slowly teaches your brain to fear your own goals. That's not productivity. That's damage with a planner. And this is the part that changes what productivity even means, because at some point, you have to stop asking, how do I get more done? And start asking, how do I build a life I can actually stay inside? That's the real question. And once you ask that, everything starts to rearrange. You start to realize that energy is not a side issue. It's the foundation, because without energy, everything good in your life becomes harder to access. Your focus, your creativity, your patience, your courage, your relationships, all of it. And once your energy drops low enough, you don't just do less, you become less available to your own life. That's why this book matters. Not because it gives you a cuter to-do list, but because it gives you permission to stop treating suffering as your default operating system. And for a lot of ambitious people, that permission changes everything, because deep down, they've been waiting for someone to tell them this. That they don't have to keep earning their right to rest, that they don't have to keep proving their seriousness through exhaustion, that they don't have to keep using self-pressure as their main source of motion. They can build differently and still be excellent, maybe even more excellent. Because when your work stops costing so much emotionally, you can finally stay with it long enough to become exceptional. That's the irony. The softer-looking system often produces the stronger long-term result, because it lasts. And this is where all the pieces click together. You're not trying to become more productive. Not really. You're trying to build a way of working where energy supports effort, where emotion supports action, where meaning supports consistency. That's what this is really about. Not output for its own sake, but a life where doing meaningful things doesn't constantly feel like dragging yourself uphill. Because when work always feels heavy, eventually you stop trusting yourself. You start thinking, maybe I'm just inconsistent. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe I'm the kind of person who only works in bursts. But that's not always true. Sometimes you've just been trying to perform inside the wrong emotional architecture. And once that changes, you change. Not instantly, but deeply. Think about the two versions of a person who hears this message. The first one nods along. They agree with all of it. They even feel emotional for a second. But tomorrow, they go right back to guilt, back to urgency, back to waiting until things hurt enough to matter. And because nothing externally looks broken, they keep living inside the same exhausting loop, maybe for years. The second person hears the same thing, but they do something different. They stop moralizing their behavior. They stop calling themselves lazy. They stop worshiping stress, and instead, they get curious. They start asking better questions. Why is this task heavy? What emotion is here? What kind of friction am I ignoring? What is my system actually training me to feel? That person doesn't become perfect, but they become aware. And awareness changes behavior faster than shame ever will. That's the mirror this book holds up. Not are you productive, but what kind of emotional life is your productivity creating? That's a much more honest question, and a much more useful one. So if you actually want to apply this, not someday, today, start here. The first thing you could do is stop forcing yourself through a task before diagnosing the block. When you feel resistance, pause for a second and ask, is this unclear? Is this scary? Or am I just not in motion yet? That one question can save you hours, because once you know the real blocker, you stop fighting the wrong enemy. If it's unclear, define the next visible step. If it's scary, lower the emotional stakes. If it's inertia, make the first action laughably small. That's practical. That works. And more importantly, it respects how humans actually operate. The second thing you can do is add energy before demanding output. This is where most people get the sequence backwards. They think, once I get enough done, I'll feel better. But a lot of the time, you need to feel a little better first. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to open the door. Enough to make starting less emotionally expensive. That could mean changing where you work, putting on better music, taking a 10-minute walk before deep work, calling someone who energizes you, reframing a task from I have to, I choose to. Small shift, massive difference. Because your brain doesn't just respond to goals, it responds to atmosphere. An atmosphere can be designed. And the third thing, this one matters more than it seems. Audit what is draining you not because it's difficult, but because it feels disconnected from what matters. That distinction will save you years. Because hard things are not always the problem. Meaningless hard things are. Misaligned hard things are. The kind of effort that empties you without building anything real inside you. That's the danger. So ask yourself honestly, what in my week keeps taking energy from me without giving any life back? That question alone can start changing your calendar. And once your calendar changes, your emotional life changes too, because your days are not neutral. They are training you every day toward aliveness or away from it. And now we get to the part that stays with you, the part that quietly rearranges everything that came before. Because after all of this, after the frameworks, the blockers, the energy, the burnout, the identity, the deepest truth in this book is actually very simple. The goal is not to become someone who can endure more misery. It's to become someone who can build a life they don't need stress to enter. That's the shift. Not how do I tolerate more, but how do I build better? Not how do I force more, but how do I remove what makes force necessary? Not how do I keep proving myself, but what would work look like if I stop using pain as proof that I care? That question is dangerous in the best possible way. Because once you ask it honestly, a lot of your old systems stop feeling impressive. They just start feeling expensive. And that's when real change begins. So go back to the beginning for a second. That version of you who only comes alive under pressure. The one who waits. The one who panics. The one who tells themselves they work best like this. Maybe that version of you isn't broken. Maybe they're just adapted. Adapted to a system that taught them stress was the price of movement. And if that's true, then maybe the work now is not to become a harder person. Maybe the work is to become a safer place for your own ambition to live. That's what this book is really offering. Not laziness, not softness, not lowered standards. Something much more useful than that. A way to stay ambitious without making your inner life pay for it. And for a lot of people, that changes more than productivity. It changes what success is allowed to feel like. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What's one area of your life where stress has quietly become your main source of motivation? Sit with that, because your answer to that question probably explains more than your planner ever will.